on to history, I'm gonna step back a ways, because the interesting thing was that in doing, the little bit of research that I do, along with finding the images, I discovered something that I didn't know, that I think is very interesting. And it involves a painter that Beryl and I spent our time looking for in Sicily. And go away. How do I get this out of the way? Antonello da Messina. I was not aware of him till we were in Sicily this last time. And it turns out he was the one Sicilian artist who was a major figure in the Renaissance. The Renaissance was happening in northern Italy. Southern Italy, from Naples south, was controlled by Spain, was kind of under the hand of the Inquisition. It didn't make any major contribution to the Renaissance at all, except for this rather unusual artist, Antonello da Messina, who, as his name suggests, was born in Messina, which is right on the coast of Sicily, right across from Italy at the closest point. So it was a very important trade point, and it also was a place where they developed the production of and trade in silk, because some Italian monks went to China earlier on and stole the secret of the silkworms from the Chinese and brought it back to Italy. Anyway, Antonello is born in Messina, becomes a major artist there, and then he goes to study in I should add, but first, before I even say that, Beryl and I were looking for him throughout Sicily, but everywhere we went where there was supposed to be a painting by him, it had gone, because they were doing a major exhibition of his work in Milan. And it was very frustrating. But we would eventually run into him. But before I get to that, let me mention what he did that was so interesting. He went to Naples to study. Oh, I'm sorry. My presentation is not up to spot tonight. This was the painting we finally discovered in Messina when we got there, because Messina has this very checkered history, and in 1908, they had an earthquake there and a tsunami, a 60-foot tsunami, which in a few minutes killed 75% of the people in the city. Massive disaster. And a huge amount of their artwork and most of their buildings were destroyed. This was something that was saved, and they treasure it because it's one of the finest works that they have by their native son. Of course, it's not in that good shape, but we were blown away by it when we saw it in Messina, and I don't know how much of that comes across in this reproduction, but it has a wonderful quality of golden light to the whole painting, and wonderful detailing of the figures, which are very sensitively and beautifully done. And the color in general has just fascinated us. We spent like about half an hour looking at it. And the whole time there was a guard watching us, because they're incredibly protective of this painting. So that was our major encounter with him on our trip, because we didn't actually get to Milan to see the show of his work. But the story of Antonello is very interesting, because he went, early on in his career, he went to Naples, and in Naples, because southern Italy was part of Spain, and Spain controlled the lowlands in those days, the Netherlands, he ran into this painting by not this painting, but a painting by Jan van Eyck.
Wow.
Jan van Eyck is the first painter to use oil paint, and he's often credited with inventing oil painting. And this was actually his second oil painting. It was done actually for an Italian merchant who lived in the Netherlands. And it's quite a stunning painting, and the realism in it is just utterly amazing. If you look at it closely, you can even see the reflections of the couple in this mirror here.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wedding painting, celebrating the wedding of this couple. Well, Antonello was so impressed, he sought out one of the leading disciples of Van Eyck, who was in Naples at the time, and studied with him, and proceeded to produce some really incredible paintings for his period. He's earlier than, he's actually born about 20 years. Well, let's look at the date of his birth again. Yeah, he's actually born 15 years before Leonardo, so he's very early on in the period of the High Renaissance, and he spends, what's important in his story is in his later years, he spends some of his last years in Venice painting. This is one of his Venetian paintings. A rather unusual crucifixion. With incredibly detailed landscape. And he had a profound effect on the Venetian artists, who immediately turned to oil painting and were very influenced by his work. He himself, in going north, became quite influenced by Piero della Francesca. And you can see that influence in this painting in a certain stillness of the scene, which is true in all of his paintings. It's particularly true in this one of Saint Sebastian, which is one of his more famous paintings. But this is reminiscent, if you remember, the Piero della Francesca flagellation that had this incredible stillness to it. This painting also has that stillness. Here's a guy who's full of arrows, and he's just very quietly meditating on his fate. It's a very powerful and very strange painting. And look how, like Piero della Francesca, he's integrated the figure completely convincingly into this flawless perspective space. With other people going about their business here, two ladies looking down on him, you know. But in its own way, I think a stunning work. And so he also liked to do, he was one of the first painters to do portraits for his own pleasure. But this is not, this looks like it might just be a portrait, but it's not. It's actually a rather original depiction of the Annunciation, which people at the time would understand that this was Mary during the Annunciation, but we're looking at her from the point of view of the angel who's bringing her the message. But just, to me, just a beautiful portrait with wonderful attention to the hands. And a face and a stillness that's very reminiscent, again, of Piero della Francesca, but with a northern attention to detail that can be done with oil painting. If you have any comments as we go along, please make them. I'm very struck by this painting. And yes?
Could you talk about the color? If you have any knowledge about the color, like the skin, there's such a golden kind of glow to the skin. Yeah. Yet it's really mottled, and I'm just wondering if you know anything about the color that would have been used, or the color palette to get that kind of tone.
Well, they used in those days, they did a lot of glazing. And he was known, what he liked about oil, And, you know, they also worked, the early oil paint was often using walnut oil, which dries very slowly. So it was possible to go back into areas and blend the colors while they were wet. And you can see that this face is a lot of blended color. It probably was, it was often the case that you would do a ground in cool colors just to design, you know, with a cool, often a blue-green, light blue-green. You'd let that dry. That would be your kind of chiaroscuro drawing of the face. Then you go back with your flesh tones when that was dry, and you'd work all your flesh tones wet on top of that. I can't say that much more because I'm, you know, I don't know what his exact techniques were, and he was at the very beginning of oil painting.
Yeah.
In the South.
Thank you.
This was a huge work that he did in Venice, of which we only have some pieces. We have these 3 pieces, which are actually virtually assembled because they're in, the huge piece was cut up at some point and ended up in different parts of the world. But here it's been virtually reassembled. This a portion, the large work was much bigger. But it gives you some idea of what an amazingly accomplished artist this man was. And also just wonderfully tender depiction of Mary and Jesus here, without sentimentality. Now it seems to, I suspect the flesh tones have faded here, that he may have been using glazes that have faded. The flesh tones here feel more natural. And this piece would have been somewhere else and kept under different conditions. But he blew the Venetians' minds, and they all began to take up oil painting, and they were all to a lesser or greater degree influenced by his work. And there's a very interesting connection here. So he did this is a very famous painting of his. It's actually Christ the Redeemer, done very simply, kind of like his Mary, Annunciation of Mary. He's resting his hand on the cross, and the cross fingers here refer to the cross. And this particular gesture, these fingers, indicates he's the Redeemer. There are several things that to me are very interesting about this. One is he depicts Christ as a very humble person and as a Southerner. This isn't the Northern blonde Christ at all. This is kind of a Sicilian Christ, probably closer to the real Christ, actually. But a very powerful and beautiful portrait, which was in Venice. We're pretty sure it was in Venice in 1530, when Leonardo had to flee Milan because of the Duke of Milan had been overthrown, and went to Venice. And Leonardo would have seen this painting, and he did his own version of it, which is very famous because we only recently confirmed the Christ the Redeemer.
This came to San Francisco last year. Right,
Yes.
I saw that.
Christ the Redeemer. Now, what's interesting about this is the practice of oil painting taken to Venice by Antonello was then taken by Florentine artists who were in Venice back to Florence. And that's how Leonardo got hold of the technique. He saw that painting we've already seen of Hugo van der Goes and decided to take up oil painting. But it was indirectly as a result of Antonello. At the point that Leonardo saw Antonello's painting, Antonello had been gone from Venice and had been dead for about 20 or 30 years. But look at how Leonardo's Christ is not the humble carpenter's son of Antonello's work. Again, he's got almost an aristocratic quality to him, but an incredibly powerful painting, which if you look at the two of them together, you can see how one painting influences the other. It's quite fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the chin.
Well, the expression in the face is similar, that the eyes are very much downplayed in Leonardo's compared to Antonello's. But there's something in the expression of the face. The gesture of the hands is almost the same.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't have to indicate the cross here as Antonello does, because there's a cross here
Mm-hmm.
on his clothing. See, everything is symbolic. This is the universe, the sphere. But what has a humility, a humbleness, and a very direct message here becomes almost mystic in Leonardo's painting. It's very interesting.
What about the chin, the neck and the chin in both of them? Are so diffused to where,
Yeah,
like,
true.
is that his beard, or he doesn't have one, or
In both paintings, there is a beard, and you know that may have been a detail which faded somewhat because it's a lot of small brush strokes.
Huh.
It may have faded slightly with time, but yeah, the beard is hiding the chin in both of them. It's interesting that Leonardo's Christ has almost the same. You know, you can't. Leonardo's paintings often the hair has disappeared in places because he used such thin paint. It's true with the Mona Lisa. But he has a mustache and a beard that's exactly the same as the one in Antonello's painting. And long hair, more beautifully indicated. Antonello's hair is a little bit slightly disheveled compared to Leonardo's. But both of them do a wonderful job with the hands. Anyway, I had not been aware of Antonello's role until I was doing research for this section, and or this particular link, which I think is utterly fascinating, because the two artists are relating, or Leonardo is relating with someone who actually brought him the technique that he used. So we now move back to the same period as Leonardo and Michelangelo and the third figure of the great triumvirate of the high Renaissance, Raphael. Now, Raphael was born in Urbino, which is where Piero della Francesca worked for a long time in the court, and also left paintings there. So Raphael was very familiar with Piero della Francesca's work. The court of Urbino, as I mentioned before, under the first Duke, was the first sophisticated court of the Renaissance. And their star was the son of the court painter under the first Duke, Raphael, who became, well, his father died when he was 8. He was a fully developed artist with a workshop doing sophisticated paintings for the court at age 12. So he's kind of like a Mozart of the painting world. I mean, this guy was just incredibly precocious. And clearly had, judging from his work, had a photographic memory. He's brilliant. He doesn't explore nature the way Leonardo does. What he explores is painting and the means to do the very best paintings in the style of the period that it was possible to do. He isn't particularly original. but he's utterly brilliant. And he was also, because he was raised in the court of Urbino and from childhood, totally successful, totally comfortable with court, and a sophisticated courtier who charmed everyone who met him. In his early 20s, he headed to Florence, where one of the, at a time when Leonardo was there, and he had a meeting with Leonardo. But before I get to that, I'm jumping ahead here. I should say one more thing about the court of Urbino. This is a later portrait by Rafael of a man who was a courtier in Urbino under the Duke, but later became a friend of Rafael. This was painted actually when Rafael was in Rome. But this man was a very famous courtier, writer, diplomat, thinker, philosopher, who wrote a very famous book called The Book of the Courtier, which became the standard for how courts and courtiers should operate in courts in Renaissance Italy, and spread throughout Europe, actually. But this shows you what an incredible portraitist Rafael was in his mature period. I think it's just a stunning, stunning portrait of a good friend. Okay, so he comes from the court at age 20. He comes to Florence and meets Leonardo and immediately absorbs Leonardo. And you can see his adaptation here of Leonardo's composition, which is Leonardo does a number of compositions with the Madonna and 2 or 3 other figures in a triangular composition. Raphael has absorbed it. But if you look closely, his attention to detail is not as great as Leonardo's. His plants are not as detailed or accurate. His landscape is simpler. And there's a sweetness to his figures that and there's a sweetness to all of Raphael's work, actually, which is not present in Leonardo's work, but of course endeared him to the period. He also absorbed what was going on in Florence around integrating figures into architectural space. This was also done during his Florentine period. And we've got this sort of ideal architectural space, and then the figures are arrayed in front of it. I mean, you can see how completely he's absorbed what was going on at that time. It's the marriage of the Virgin, with, I'm sure, all sorts of symbols in it that Renaissance people would understand. So as we already looked at this painting, but I want to bring it back to you because he's called to Rome by the Pope at age 24, and he's given the job of painting the private rooms the Pope is going to take over to occupy, Pope Julius II, the warrior Pope. This was the first fresco he did there, and it's the one that is completely by his hand. And it's the School of Athens. And you remember it has Leonardo in it and Michelangelo. Michelangelo was very jealous of Raphael for getting this commission. Michelangelo was quite a jealous person, actually. And one time later in life, he would say, Raphael learned everything he knew from me, which of course is ridiculous, but he said that. But he also said some good things about Raphael. But here's Raphael. Can you see him there? Can you follow my cursor? He put himself in the painting here.
You know, a white robe?
The white robe, yes.
It looks like a woman.
I was going to
Well,
say,
he's got an almost effeminate look to him, but you know, of all these painters, he's the only one we know was of the painters we've been discussing who was crazy about women.
Very feminine.
He had any number of lovers, according to the historians in Rome. Of course, it was very easy to find lovers there. Rome at the time had something like 30,000 prostitutes to serve the church, actually, serve the priests. He also did, as he worked, he began to he hired a group of something like 50 assistants, but for a while he still did most of the work. And this is one that's really quite interesting. It's an angel puts the guards to sleep and comes to where St. Peter is imprisoned in Rome. And first the guard and then leads St. Peter out of the prison. See, the guards are sleeping. But what's really interesting about this is it's a night painting, and there was only one other night painting that we know of from this period. And it just happens to be, well, first we'll look at a detail of this before I show you the other painting.
Is that painting in a church?
It's in the Vatican. It's in the Julius II's private quarters.
Oh.
But here is a detail of that central portion of the angel coming to free St. Peter. Really quite stunning. Quite a stunning lighting effect there. But what's interesting is, remember, he was very influenced by Piero della Francesca. He would have definitely seen Piero della Francesca's fresco cycle in Arezzo. And one of the interesting things about that particular fresco cycle is it has a night scene, which I will show you when I find it. Here it is. This is the dream of Constantine. An angel is bringing the cross, which is hard to see in here, but it's the cross, to Constantine, saying, bear this into battle, and God will lead you to victory. Constantine is dreaming this, but a night scene, and it's the only other one, and it would have been something that Rafael would have been familiar with. So another kind of cross-pollination between these artists. Now, he continued to do frescoes in these rooms. There were so many rooms, huge walls. This one he did mostly himself, but now with the help of assistants. And it begins to show. I think that as stunning as this is compositionally, to me, some of the painting isn't quite as good as in the School of Athens. But this is an interesting story. It's from the Old Testament, and it's the story of, it's from, just a second. It's from Maccabees number 2. It's a story of when the king of Persia sent Heliodorus, who's down on the ground here, to rob the temple in Jerusalem of its gold. And the priest prays for assistance, and God sends a horseman and 2 assistants to drive Heliodorus out of the temple. Well, what's really interesting here is, if you look at this priest, this rabbi here, he's actually a likeness of Julius II. So Julius II now is a rabbi praying in front of a menorah. A massive menorah. Because at this point in time, the Catholic Church was more interested in reading and studying the Hebrew texts and talking and debating with the rabbis than they were in persecuting the Jews. It was a period of very open conversation and interest. It's the way Julius II was a very worldly character. And on the left here is Julius II. I'll show you a couple of details now. Here's the expulsion going on. And here we see, I mean, it's a very well painted horse, but it's kind of, when you look at the head and the mane, it's almost, there's a prettiness to it. It's very different from the horses of Leonardo, even though it has the same kind of skill. But it's but you can see he's learned from Leonardo. He's got some of the facial expressions that you see in Leonardo's work here, and some very good drawing. I mean, incredibly good drawing in here. And on the other side of that same mural, Julius II is surveying this historical moment as if it's in the present. And this is Rafael standing next to him. But some very nice, very actually restrained color here, which is kind of interesting. So as he continued the Roms, he was being loaded down with other tasks by the Pope. After Bramante died, he put Rafael in charge of rebuilding St. Peter's, continuing the rebuilding of St. Peter's, and gave him a whole bunch of other jobs, including surveying the antiquities of Rome. So Rafael would do the drawings for his cartoon, for the frescoes, but he had his 50 assistants doing most of the painting. But look at these drawings. Look what a good draftsman this guy is. And he did them, I'm sure, at great speed, judging from the number he produced. But these would have been studies for one of his murals.
Wow, those hands.
Yes, and also
Gorgeous.
did very lovely drawings of women, actually. Oh, that's not the right one. Where is the one? Oh. I seem to have lost a very nice drawing. Huh. Well, that's too bad. This drawing here, oh, here it is. I mean, that's really beautiful drawing.
Wow.
See, he's as interested in the female body as Michelangelo was in the male body. Which was something new in the Renaissance. Most Renaissance, up to this point, in the Renaissance, they considered the male body to be perfect and the female body to be imperfect. Here's an interesting drawing. Anyone who knows classical history, without any further introduction, would know that this is Aeneas carrying his father out of burning Troy. And the story that Virgil wrote as the founding story of Rome is that Aeneas took his father and family out of burning Troy, fled on the Mediterranean, and finally, after a long journey, much like Ulysses' journey, arrived in Italy and was the founder of Rome. But a beautiful drawing in which you really get the sense of him struggling under the weight of his father, and his father just very limp on his body. But what's interesting is we have the painting, which was done by someone else, based on that drawing. And in my opinion, it doesn't really hold up to the drawing. It's got a certain, I mean, the outline is almost the same, except up here he raised the other artist raised the head of Aeneas's father, maybe to indicate more that he was an old man. But there's a kind of lumpiness to the depiction of the figure, which you don't see in Raphael's work, and a slight awkwardness, despite the fact the outline seems identical and was probably drawn directly from this cartoon. Well, Raphael was to die of a fever at age 34.
Oh, wow. Young.
He, as I said, he had many lovers, and the Pope actually had lined up a wife for him. The popes in those days were very intrusive. But Raphael avoided this marriage because he was in love, that there was one woman he was actually really in love with, who was a baker's daughter. And he painted this really quite beautiful painting of her. And just the way he's looking at him is quite beautiful too, I think, in this painting. And he also painted her. He painted her many times as many different people, including, of course, Virgin Mary. He actually was so taken with this woman and would often disappear for days from his job in the Vatican. And the Pope finally set up a special room for them in the Vatican so that she could stay there and he wouldn't wander off. But this is, I think, a lovely portrait of her. And if you look closely, it's almost the same gesture as the other painting, which may be purposeful, I don't know. But if you compare them,
What color are those backgrounds?
say that again.
Reddish. What color are those backgrounds? Is it like a reddish brown or it's just a beautiful, rich, neutral color?
Yeah, it could be a burnt umber. It's one of the earth colors, probably not even mixed very much.
Okay.
But or raw umber in the case of this one, I'm not sure. But look how the gesture is almost the same here, and the angle of it's almost the same. But you can see what a superb portraitist he was, and he was one of the first artists to do portraits for his own pleasure. I mean, they weren't all commissions. Antonello was the other one, actually, who did that. Well, that basically, so, you know, the story goes that he was out overexerting himself with his lover and got a fever and died. I mean, that's, you know, one of those Renaissance stories. I think he died of malaria, which was very common in Rome at the time and in much of Italy. But anyway, it's interesting, his work astonished and absolutely charmed everyone. But in the end, it was Michelangelo who cast his shadow over the next 100 years. Raphael actually was not considered as important as Michelangelo. And it was only about 150 years later that people turned to Raphael, and he became the preferred Renaissance artist for about 200 years. Fashions change. And that's the end of our history for tonight. And as I said, next week we'll be talking about painting and painting techniques and easels and things like that.
Yay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you, Anthony.